Hello. Ah, there it is. Hi. It's wonderful to see you here. And we have just a fabulous panel, and we're going to talk about emergent technologies. But the way that we parse it, we twisted it around. We're asking, how do technologies emerge? What are the processes that make that possible? So that's our subtitle, Making Technologies Emerge, Commercialized Military Power Since 1945. And today's event is the sixth in a year-long series called Democracy and Emergent Technology, which it has addressed some very important questions. This is being put on by the Andrea Mitchell Center and Perry World House, which is where we are. And you should please look out for information on future events and other panels and seminars. So our format today will be, I will present some short introductions of myself and of the other panelists, and also a very short framing of what we hope to be able to talk about, and we really do. We're happy to see an audience here. We're interested in what you have to say. They will present some opening statements. We will have a sort of a free-ranging discussion of questions and issues in this domain, and after some point of time, about halfway through, we will open the event for questions and discussion from you, and we look forward to your participation and your interest. So who am I? I'm a historian of Cold War science and technology at the University of Pennsylvania. I have worked for a long time on questions of science, technology, and war. My books include Suffering Made Real, American Science and the Survivors at Hiroshima, and more recently in 2021, Rational Fog from Harvard University Press, which is a study, well, actually it's an interrogation or an effort to understand how violence, organized violence, and military technology intersect. How does it work? How does that connection between violence and science and knowledge systems work? So that's an effort to come up with some synthetic and analytical ways of understanding that. Our two, hold on a second. Oh, good. Our first distinguished panelist is Melissa FLAGG. And she is the founder and president of FLAGG Consulting, LLC. She's also a fellow at the Acquisition Innovation Research Center and a visiting fellow here at Perry World House. Prior to this, she was a senior fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University, and she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research, responsible for policy and oversight of Defense Department science and technology programs. She has worked in the State Department, the Office of Naval Research, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. She also worked at the John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation and the Army Research Laboratory. Dr. FLAGG has served on numerous boards, including the National Academy of Sciences Air Force Studies Board and the Department of Commerce Emerging Technology Research Advisory Committee. She's currently on the advisory board for the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation and on the board of directors for the Missouri S&T Policy Initiative. She holds a PhD in pharmaceutical chemistry and a BS in pharmacy. She's had a very important career in defense science and technology. Our second distinguished panelist is Rebecca Slayton. She is associate professor jointly in the Science and Technology Studies Department and the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, and these are both at Cornell University. She is also a 2022-2023 fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Her research examines the relationships between and among risk, governance, and expertise, and she has a focus on international security and cooperation since World War II. Her first book, Arguments That Count, shows how the rise of computing reshaped perceptions of the promise and risks of missile defense, and it won the 2015 Computer History Museum Prize. Slayton's second book, Shadowing Cybersecurity, examines the historical emergence of cybersecurity expertise through the interplay of innovation and repair, one of the interesting topics in science and technology studies today. In 2019, SLAYTON was a recipient of the United States Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. I want to point out that it is very unusual to have a panel of 3 women scholars who all work on military science and technology, so we're trying to decide how to celebrate that. What's happened in the field is that questions of war, and especially science and technology, have increasingly attracted female scholars for reasons that none of us know. We all have our individual stories for how we got here, but what we're happy about this all-female panel on a topic usually understood to somehow engage only with men, when in fact military technology has consequences for everybody and is important across domains. Now, I'll talk a little bit about my idea for framing and what we were trying to think about how technological innovations occur. And I would say it's routine that they oscillate from civilian to military domains. And I have a few examples. So, Agent Orange began as a result of what we might call pure science studies of leaf formation and the destruction of leaves in plants as they grew. This was a scholar, a scientist at Harvard who was trying to understand botanical development, but his findings about how leaf formation works and what can interfere with it, what makes it more difficult, led eventually through Army pathways to the development of Agent Orange and the other rainbow agents that were widely used during the Vietnam War to produce the loss of plant life in Vietnam, with devastating consequences in terms of the legacies of dioxin waste left there. Sometimes defense technologies become critical civilian resources, even though this is not necessarily the dominant process. So for example, a rugged, readily usable laptop was desired by the US Army, and this Army technology eventually became a commercial technology with which we are all familiar. So the military needs produced a certain way of understanding what a computer had to be, and then that led to an entire commercial enterprise. Penicillin, as you must know, was based on a relatively obscure paper published in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, who was studying bacteria and who recognized conflict between mold and bacteria by accident on a few plates that were left out over the weekend. His discovery did not immediately lead to the mass production of penicillin. It was not until the threat of the war in 1939 that an effort began to turn that civilian and what we might call pure science discovery into something that could have medical and military implications that could reshape the way that wars were fought because of the survival of those who had been seriously injured. And I'm going to have a final one is the radioactive tracers, which really were explicitly intended to redeem nuclear weapons. Remember, there's a movement after 1945 to turn nuclear weapons into a positive gain for humanity, into things that brought something good, including nuclear energy, including radioactive tracers, which were ways of understanding environmental change or environmental risk, but also had medical consequences, medical implications. And so this is a technology that then it has multiple purposes, and it ends up playing a role today in our understanding of global warming. So the breakthrough technologies and science funding methods that emerged from the 1939-1945 war accelerated the process in both directions. What I'm thinking about now here is something like this oscillating or circulating systems of knowledge of technologies that either begin as civilian and become military, begin as military and become civilian, and how does that work, and how do we encourage the development of new technologies? But defense interests, as my panelists and I have long recognized, they do not necessarily in any simple way control these processes. They don't control these shifting technological regimes. Existing policies and practices around technology and technology development and science development have blind spots, and they even have some elements of historical amnesia. So as these few examples suggest, technologies create both new threats and new opportunities as they're developed, expanded, commercialized, and incorporated sometimes simultaneously across military and civilian practices and spaces. So I think one of the things we wanted to think about was how to develop possible strategies to more effectively use defense resources, to recognize new technologies, incubate new technologies, understand their risks, predict their consequences, and control their use. And with that, I will turn to our panelists, and I think Dr. Flagg, you are slated to present your opening comments.
Thank you. It's exciting to hear somebody use an example other than GPS. So thank you. I feel like if I hear Siri and GPS one more time in another Wired magazine article, I am going to fall asleep. So my background is very much as a practitioner, right? I have a technical PhD, but it has very little to do with security. Obviously, pharmaceutical chemistry, not a straight line. I wound up actually working for the military largely because I went to Washington on a policy fellowship, was at the State Department when 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, there was a huge, obviously, pivot to very security-related topics. Research security, which is a big topic today, became incredibly sort of all-consuming in Washington. And after I finished my fellowship at the State Department, I wound up with an opportunity to move to London to work with the Navy, doing international collaboration around technologies of mutual interest to sort of both science and kind of open science and open international collaboration, but also with specific utility to the military. So really from the very beginning of my career, I've had a huge focus on this intersection between open science, open source, dual use research. And as I progressed and then eventually made my way into a much more senior role at the Department of Defense, where I was doing oversight across all of the services and a much larger portfolio of more applied work, beginning to understand how do you not only engage the academic community, but how do you actually think about engaging the industrial community and understanding how technology products are emerging and how those affect both what we can do within the Department of Defense, but also then what the marketplace of ideas actually holds, that when you actually wind up in conflict, and I think Ukraine is a great example of this, all of the folks now have a relatively level playing field to draw from that marketplace of technology and ideas and to be very creative and to use those technologies in interesting and novel ways. And so one of the things that's a huge change post-World War II to now, and something that I think a lot about and that I spend a lot of intellectual time on, is the fact that we created structures, control regimes, science funding agencies, bilateral and multilateral agreements in science and technology globally in an era when federal governments, and most especially the US federal government, had an incredibly dominant role in both global R&D investment as well as domestic US R&D investment. In 1960, the US federal government was almost 70% of global R&D investment and was almost 70% of domestic R&D investment. In 1960, the US Department of Defense had almost 30% of global R&D investment, made up almost 30% of global R&D investment. It's really hard to wrap your head around the kind of dominance that that had in the kind of post-World War II space where many of the global S&T leaders had been, their capacity had been destroyed during the wars, right? And so a lot of the talent from France and Germany and the UK had actually come to the United States. So fast forward to today, all of the structures that we created are grown in this moment, in this Cold War era. Today, the US federal government makes up about a quarter of global R&D. China makes up about a quarter of global R&D. The rest of the world makes up another 50%. In 2000, global R&D was about 690 billion. Today, it's almost 2.4 trillion. So there's a lot of money bouncing around. There's a lot of talent bouncing around. A few countries are no longer the gatekeepers for science and technology, and a few countries are no longer really ever going to dominate. This is not a bilateral engagement between the US and China, like I think a lot of folks on both sides of that argument like to make it. The global R&D environment is vast, disseminated, proliferated, and interesting. Domestically, the US federal government only makes up about 21% of R&D funding. And so think about what it means when the US DoD or the US federal government are a minority customer of some of the most critical emerging technologies for national security in the world. Think about what you see with Elon Musk right now in Ukraine deciding whether they will have access to resources like Starlink or not. It's not the US government deciding it. It's not the Germans deciding it. It's not the Russians deciding it or the Ukrainians. It's a guy, right? And so it's interesting that this challenges our thinking about control regimes, about influence, about the structures of influence we need, the types of domestic engagement that we need. When in the post-World War II era, we've been very externally focused, et cetera. So these are all questions that I spend a lot of time on right now and am extremely interested in because I think they ultimately inform a very different set of potential options going forward than necessarily the ones that we relied on post-World War II.
Professor Slayton.
Thank you. I'm live. All right. Thank you for the introduction and for the comments. I'll just say I also have a very nonlinear path. I actually did my PhD in chemistry, not pharmaceutical chemistry. It was more like physics. But during grad school, I fell in love with the history of science and technology because it gave me a way of radically re-understanding what science and technology were in social and cultural terms, and that's where I've landed. So for students in the audience, you never know where you're going to get, but it'll be fun. So just follow the interesting questions. That's my little piece of advice. Over the last few years, I've been trying to use some insights from the field of science and technology studies to understand some very pressing problems and questions in the fields of international relations, international politics. So I'll just mention a couple of them, which I think pick up nicely on the comments that both Susan and LINDEE, Susan and Melissa have raised. So the first question has to do with how technology shapes governance. And this is a major area of dispute within the field of international relations. Scholars have argued that new technologies are empowering non-state actors, eroding state sovereignty, the ascendance of Elon Musk being one such example, among potentially many others. But also more broadly, even aside from great individuals, if we look at the internet, we could argue that it gives hackers tools to not only attack states, but to evade their regulations. We might even regard some of those developments as good. So most of us in the United States probably think it's good to give people tools to get around the Great Firewall of China, which is a mechanism for repressing and suppressing freedom of speech in China. Scholars also argue that technologies are increasing interdependence. They create the use of these technologies by non-state actors and states creates transboundary problems. The most pressing of these, in my view, is climate change. It's not something that any individual state can reverse. And it's something that is produced by the most powerful states, predominantly by the most powerful states, but whose consequences will be suffered the worst by the least powerful. Technologies also increase interdependence. So that's an example of interdependence. It also increases just interpenetration, exchange, social, cultural exchanges between countries. At least this is one set of narratives that we have, and there's some truth to them. Where I think the STS scholars, science and technology studies scholars, have a space to push forward our understanding on that, is in thinking about why we have the technologies we do and not some other set of technologies. So rather than seeing these, most international relations scholars start with, here's the technologies, here's the material conditions we have, now what are their impacts? And backing up and saying, well, why do they have these qualities that give them these particular impacts? And hence the name of our panel, Making Technologies Emerge. We don't want to just say that technologies have this way of moving and emerging all by themselves. We are making them emerge through the institutions that we create, sustain. So that's one set of questions. The second set of questions that's been occupying a lot of my thought time lately is the question of, and it's very closely related, why do we have some vulnerabilities, some technological vulnerabilities, and not others? And I think I want to argue that we actually choose our vulnerabilities to a certain extent. And just to give one example of that, we've chosen the vulnerabilities of living with largely unregulated information technologies. This was not a technological necessity. There were choices made by governments about not regulating security in technologies. I can say more about that if there's interest later. And it has benefits. Firms can innovate very quickly. They do not have the hindrances of strict regulation, but it also comes with a certain set of vulnerabilities to security and other kinds of issues that we would not have if we had regulated communications information technologies more stringently with respect to their security earlier. So those are a couple of the questions I'm thinking about and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. One of the things that we had thought as a possible framing, in many cases when technologies appear, there's a sort of narrative that they're unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before. It's a new technology, it's innovative, it changes the world, or it changes everything about warfare. And one of the technologies where that commonly is invoked, and I hear it all the time, and I know you guys do, relates to like cyber war and artificial intelligence and potential threats that don't look like tanks on the border. So they don't look like conventional armed conflict. And so the next sentence is the sentence that I want us to kind of think about. It says, war is completely different now. Everything has changed. And what I wonder is how you two respond to that. What are the historical continuities between these dramatic, admittedly dramatic and pretty scary new technologies? And do they actually change the nature of warfare? I don't know.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. This is getting back to the question of what are the impacts of technologies,
Yes, exactly.
than sort of why we have the particular set of technologies that we do. But it's a really important question and very much one that we all are trying to grapple with. So for example, we know that cyberspace is vulnerable. Does it matter? I mean, you know, the US has been relying on vulnerable cyberspace for quite a while, and yet we're still surviving and, you know, going for, some people point to major decline and problems, and we can dispute that, but there are questions about how these new capabilities really have strategic impact or not. I want to talk about, I guess, 2 points of, I'm going to mostly talk about points of novelty, while emphasizing that these are, there's also strong continuity here as well. So the 2 things that I want to highlight are the growing knowledge intensity of producing research and technology and the kinds of operations that we are doing, and the growing globalization, which I think Melissa addressed very nicely and I'm sure can speak to more. But the associated interdependence with the global scale and organization of research development and other kinds of security-related operations. So before getting into discussion of what's the knowledge and information intensity of research development operations, I want to preface this by saying I do not think we should understate in any way the continuing importance of physical stuff. Computers, guns, which we have—
I'll talk about that.
Yes, which we have very tragically seen killing people in the United States in large numbers on a very regular basis, unfortunately. The howitzers that the United States and tanks that the United States has sent to Ukraine, the airplanes that are being requested, all that material stuff absolutely matters. And there is no way in which we've just sort of transitioned to this virtual age where that physical material reality doesn't matter. But there is an increased information intensity to the work that gets done to produce those technologies as well as the operations themselves. And I would argue that that's partly a result of changing perceptions of vulnerability and threat. So the United States waged war from its very founding, and much of this was a deeply unethical war against Native American peoples. But by the early 20th century, the US was pretty invulnerable from attack from most of its enemies. Enjoyed wide oceans between most of its adversaries. And that really began to change with when the United States and the Soviet Union developed long-range bombers, nuclear weapons, and some of the most pioneering developments in computing that led to our personal computing capabilities today actually came out of research on defending the United States, the ability to gather information on a potential attack and respond quickly enough. The desire to have that capability drove research into computing that gave us many of the capabilities that we do today. So that was another example of how a seeming national security imperative, which was novel at the time, drove technological development and drove a push towards really needing a lot of information and being able to manipulate and process that information very quickly. That sense of needing information and the ability to connect the dots grew even more after terrorist attacks of 9/11. If we think about Homeland Security today, a lot of it is very information-intensive kinds of operations. We experience this every time we fly. Yesterday, I went to the San Francisco airport. I handed over my driver's license. I scanned my digital ID. I put up my hands in the scanner and was checked for weapons. We do this all the time. And that's all enabled by information technologies that we didn't have, 100 years ago. There's also a kind of feedback here in that as we become more dependent on these information technologies, it's become easier for adversaries to penetrate the United States, to become insiders in a sense. So if you have an electrical grid operator whose account is compromised by a hostile outsider because they're online and their credentials can be accessed from another country, you have a major security threat. So all of a sudden these security threats are very pervasive, and information gathering and processing technologies are critical to countering those. But it's also not just the vulnerabilities or the threats that we're focused on today. It's also the fact that we've invested in more and more complex technologies. So there's an increasing knowledge intensity, the amount of money, relative amount of money that goes into research and development and producing knowledge relative to what we would traditionally call bending tin, rolling things off the factory line. So a greater and greater proportion of our spending goes into that knowledge production and the research and the development rather than producing stuff. The stuff still matters, obviously. You can have all the knowledge you want. If you don't have the tin, it doesn't do a whole lot of good on the battlefield. But of course, that's also created new vulnerabilities. The F-35 fighter jet is a great example of this. A lot of its capabilities are enabled by artificial intelligence, information technology, but then there's concerns about that being hacked as well. So the second major change that I think this is linked to then is the increasing global scale of research and development. So information tech, because there's this growing knowledge intensity to the development of technologies, firms have, the defense firm today does not look like the defense firm looked in 1950. Now there are more and more incentives to share those costs of research and development in partnerships, some of which are quite international. Which means that you have knowledge being produced in different countries that is used for national security. And another one, again, I don't want to overstate the novelty there because there's always been a global element to research and development and the production of national security technologies, but I think the scale has become increasingly global. And you particularly see this in sort of software supply chains. So if you look at the Heartbleed vulnerability that was discovered a few years ago, that really started with a piece of software that was designed by a German student. No offense to the student because people make mistakes all the time, but made a mistake, didn't get caught, was adopted by firms around the world, became the dominant protocol that was used by corporations around the world, and all of a sudden everybody went, oh, we're vulnerable. We have this thing that was developed in this place and then got taken all the way around the world. And software is, being built on top of these very stacked, layered systems. So I think I've probably gone on for too long, but I think that's an example of how the scope of research and development has changed and globalized. And I will just add one more thing and say, I think we are seeing potentially a shift away from this. If you look at, for example, Huawei being more or less banned from sales in the United States, a lot of nations are starting to sort of try to put up boundaries around the research and development that affects their countries.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this as kind of a practitioner who spent most of my life doing military technology inside the system. What I think is really interesting is that I think inside most approaches to military planning in this globalized age assume that any vulnerability I have is likely also a vulnerability that any likely adversary will be dealing with as well. So the question is, does this technology give me more advantage or more vulnerability on balance? Is it better to open up the vulnerability because I believe that my people, my training, my structures, where we will be fighting and how we will be fighting and what kind of advantage or disadvantage that gives me, does it lend itself to this particular thing being more of a vulnerability or more of an advantage? So I think one thing that I would say is that technology doesn't work in a vacuum, right? It works within a really long-standing, deeply historic, heavily hierarchical, incredibly structured system of strategy, planning, military education, and military training. And I think it's really hard sometimes from the outside to look in and to understand how this type of new technology development is plugging into this very old system. And there are advantages to that, right? To that kind of thinking about uncertainty and complexity. And there are restrictions and probably disadvantages that taking new thinking and plugging it into an old structure and an old system gives you. And so there are moments when we know that countries that, like Russia, we kind of understand each other quite well. We have a lot of experts on both sides that have been pointing at each other for decades and decades and decades, right? We have a lot of mutual language, like on each side. We have a lot of people who speak the language, who can interrogate technical information in that language. And so it's very interesting when that's a kind of known relationship. When you develop potentially adversarial relationships with countries that have emerged during this kind of technological period, their structures, hierarchies, frameworks, ways of integrating technology and thinking are quite different, and that's very interesting. And it changes how you plan and strategize. What I would actually say is that in many cases, what you see is that most of these technologies, the actual novel part for me is not that we have these surprisingly rapid uptakes of technology. It's not that they radically change the nature of war, because space assets radically changed the nature of war. Stealth technologies and precision strike radically changed the nature of war. But what the aspect of the nature of war that is changing because of the current technological developments is speed, right? And so it has accelerated the pace with which humans are required to make decisions and respond on the battlefield in ways never seen in like the history of the universe, right? And human brains aren't actually well suited to large volumes of information and sorting through sort of really, really complex decision space very quickly. One of the things the human brain does better than almost anything is delete, right? Imagine how many pieces of information you take in all day long, but you don't think about how many colors of green are in that plant. You just see it and you know it's a plant and you sort of know in your mind it's green, but your brain has deleted like 1 billion pieces of information being input into your eyeballs because we shortcut things. That's the opposite of what AI does, right? Is it takes in everything and sort of comes to what are unexplainable outcomes for us because it's processing in a fundamentally different way. So the other interesting aspect of the nature of war that is coming now is that you have humans, and it does not matter what country you are in. It just fundamentally does not, this is not an American problem or a European problem or a Chinese problem. This is a humans interfacing with a new technology problem, which is we now have technologies that are requiring us to respond at a speed that is not natural for the human brain, and that is giving us recommendations that are unexplainable in the way we process normally, right? This is interesting, scary, useful in a lot of ways, where if you have a billion x-rays that you need to analyze to find who has a brain tumor, and you've been outsourcing it to people, and you can have like a convolutional neural net, an algorithm do that for you, like, yay, go team. I would rather have my brain tumor diagnosed quickly than like wait for a billion other people to have their tumor screens looked at. And I'd like for all of us to get our tumors looked at as opposed to just rich people, right? And so there are ways in which this like technological revolution are bringing like really exciting, relevant, human-centric, beneficial outcomes. But when you specifically look at this within warfare, I have a prediction, which is because this will speed things up so much, you almost get to a point where there's an even bigger benefit in the human intervention, in the human simply opting out of the race and doing something very unpredictable to the AI. And this is where you go back to some of these things where you saw like Go and or chess, right? When you play with a computer, when you play chess, it will beat you every time until you do something that isn't in the rule book, that isn't in the training set, right? So the interesting opportunity that so much technology actually drives is potentially a resurgence of the importance of the well-trained, highly adaptable, cognitively flexible warrior. And so this is a really interesting moment where we almost come so far down the path of bringing the human out of things that the human becomes weirdly more important if you can think about how to place that human strategically back into the system in a different place. And so for me, one of the things I think is really novel about this is that it may be that we've pushed so far down the road through so many technological revolutions that we may actually wind up back at a relatively analog moment, which is interesting. I guess the last thing I'll say is, I think a lot of what Rebecca was talking about, she came back and forth between like national security, homeland security, and the military, which in many countries is the same thing. In the US is like constitutionally separate, right? Which is weird and interesting and a whole nother lecture, right? But what I do think is funny is that, not funny at all, actually, not funny, haha, but like funny, interesting, and weird, is that this technological revolution and military technology that is so proliferated and that is being driven by so many companies that are not controlled by militaries, where the military is a minority customer of that technology, so it's being proliferated out into the public space so rapidly and so effectively, is that our homeland actually has a lot more critical vulnerabilities built into it without the constructs of strategic thinking wrapped around it that make us much more vulnerable, I think, almost in the national security space out like adjacent to the military than it does actually within the military. Now, this is a controversial point of view. And if you got some like captain from the Air Force up here talking, he would disagree with me violently. So just understand this, and $5 will get you bagged coffee at Starbucks. But I do think it's worth thinking about because I don't think we talk about this enough through the context of planning. And that we have choices, by the way.
So these make me think about, well, I was thinking about 1832, Karl von Clausewitz, and the nature, and this is a fascinating comment. How can high technology circle you back to more traditional ways of understanding what it means to be effective in terms of war. And Clausewitz said, you know, the great commander is always operating with incomplete information, with confusion, moving rapidly through changing circumstances, not under complete control of all of the options and opportunities. And we're back there, although who would have thought that we would get there through the highest, most sophisticated technology, the astonishing sophistication of this technology. Now, I want to turn a little bit, I want to invite our panelists to talk a little bit about the process of making these technologies. And my little complaint and my scary image is, I'm a historian of the Cold War, and in the Cold War, there's kind of a fantasy that military technologies can be subject to secrecy, that it's possible to keep other nations from learning how to make nuclear weapons. It's possible to keep secrets about biological weapons or chemical weapons. You can control them. They're under the complete state management, and you can prosecute people because they share them. And where we are now, which is, I guess, I mean, it's kind of what Melissa hinted at, we're at a moment where that is simply not possible because of the way that innovation happens, because of the ways that technologies are made, and they are made through a corporatized system of opportunistic, what's the right word for it? It's opportunistic marketing, and the ability, and any company can sell these technologies to anybody. We in this room could we could take a collection and buy something terrible if I think it would be, but it would have to be a very generous collection. So, I'd like some commentary on that as a way of understanding how technologies emerge, and they emerge through a corporatized system of profit and completely unconstrained or almost unconstrained marketing. Yeah.
Do you mind if I take this? So I love this because I think this is like a fantasy of secrecy and uniqueness that almost all large nations with large militaries or wealthy nations believe they hold in the federal government, in the centralized system. And it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. When you have $2.4 trillion of money floating around the world, when you've got high net worth individuals developing some of the most high tech kind of technology, when they are the pace car for technology in the world today, right? The pace car for technology, is that an analogy that works here? Okay, I don't know. I just realized that might be a weird analogy. I'm from the country, so people know what that means. But like the federal governments and largely militaries were the organizations that were the pace cars for technology in like the 80s, right? But today it's largely corporations, and that's not just in the United States. You can go to Japan, you can go to Korea, you can go to Germany, and you will find that some of the largest investors in R&D are industrially based. And so the interesting thing is, not only do we want to believe in federal governments and militaries that secrecy and uniqueness they still matter and are real, in order to believe that and to sustain that belief, we largely have to not accept the truth of the fragmenting and relatively decentralized R&D ecosystem, right? You have to kind of ignore that 70% of American R&D is industrial, and that the vast majority of that industrial R&D never touches a federal agency. In fact, they will do everything they can not to, because the only thing a federal agency will do is regulate you or yell at you. They will not help your bottom line. And so there's no reason that a relatively large company, mid to large company, would engage the government willingly, unless you're Lockheed Martin or something where you know it's worth the downside, right? It's worth hiring entire suites of people to just manage that relationship. And so I think what's really fascinating is if you understand who is actually driving the pace of technology, and you actively do not develop strategic relationships with those communities, like, it seems like a recipe for problems. And certainly what we would say in the military as you're setting yourself up for technological surprise. And so I personally am like on a war against this idea of uniqueness even existing, and that we need to get over the belief that secrecy has the same value it had in the Cold War period. Where secrecy matters is how you use the technology. There is a lot of secrecy that should be maintained around the concept of operations, of how we will employ a specific technology on a specific military platform in a specific place and way. That there is a lot of secrecy that should go on around that. There is very little secrecy that is likely relevant around the math of an algorithm. I heard somebody, I'll shut up after this, but I heard somebody at the Department of Commerce say, we should do an export control on AI. And I was like, you do know AI is not a thing, right? And they were like, well, but I mean, it's this stuff that Google's doing. I'm like, it's math. Like, are you going to put math on the export control list? Like, they're algorithms. You can't put an export control on AI. Like, it's nonsensical. And like, but we need to control these things. I'm like, you don't control math. And it's the most fascinating conversation because there's so much education that comes from the Cold War. And it's not just in the United States. I mean, this is an interesting problem.
It's great. I will just comment as a historian. I mean, there was a very interesting debate in the 1980s when that's exactly, I mean, cryptography was on the export control list. It's math. And strong cryptography could not be exported. That was reversed in the 1990s. Cryptographers objected to it. American Mathematical Society took position on it. It was quite a debate. But yeah, I mean, these are not new ideas. I actually wanted to ask Melissa a little bit more about this. I'm wondering, when you're talking about secrecy, do you really mean government national security secrecy? Because of course, corporations have lots of secrets. I would argue, as a historian, it's a lot harder often to get the secrets from the companies than from the government, where you can file a FOIA. Corporations are really good at keeping their, until they get hacked, they're really good at keeping their secrets.
Yeah, I guess I do think more about classification when I think about secrecy, because that's my life. And I do actually think most companies are better at controlling it because they have fewer people with clearances, right, to the information. That being said, I actually think that even in companies now, you see that it's less and less relevant because there are so many people chasing the technology, and there are so many smart engineers and scientists in the world working in these spaces that, I mean, you see this with ChatGPT, right? OpenAI comes out with ChatGPT-4, whatever, but everybody's been working on this. It's not like large language models are like not something people do in computer science, right? And so it's like 3 more companies are saying they're rolling this out in the next like couple months, right? Google's coming out with their own. Microsoft had already been working on something else that they'll merge with ChatGPT probably. There was another company that said they had one that was going to come out. So I think that there's also just so much competition in this space. And because the technology isn't heavily based in infrastructure and manufacturing, like most of the tech revolutions were in the sort of Cold War period, and even pre-Cold War, I would say, there was just a lot more physicality to high tech, that it just makes the idea of secrecy and the slowness with which you can move that sort of is imposed by a certain amount of secrecy, whether that's corporate or governmental, becomes less of an advantage than just being the first person to the market. And so I just think it has a lot less relevance in both sides.
Yeah, thank you. I think from an STS perspective, I appreciate your comments about it mattering how you use the technology. There have been some arguments, and we got to think about knowledge on multiple levels. There's the kind of knowledge that you can transmit in bits and bytes, and there's the kinds of knowledge that are in organizations and in human bodies. And some of that computing work actually is embodied, that knowledge is embodied within organizations such that it's not easy to just upload on a disk and transmit somewhere else. But the ability to, I mean, it's part of why offshoring software didn't necessarily work so well.
Semiconductors are a great example of this tacit knowledge in the semiconductor industry. It doesn't matter how long many countries have been trying to catch up with us on semiconductors. There's a reason why it's hard, because the actual tacit knowledge of the humans involved in doing the actual engineering is quite hard. And the tooling, the high precision requirements for the tooling and the instrumentation you need to do it are so exquisite and difficult to repeat. So there's definitely versions of this for sure. And I guess it's that people matter. They matter a lot, but protecting like a piece of paper that has the information on it is less interesting to me than maybe like, I actually do want to keep my best mathematician.
Right. Well, I think the other thing to remember is that once you know something is possible, there's a possibility of reinvention elsewhere. And so there's a very well-known paper on the reinvention of nuclear weapons. So that once people knew it was possible, different countries knew it was possible, they developed their own, but there's a lot of evidence that it was actually kind of reinvention, that every country or most countries made their own mistakes all over again, developed the weapons in a new way. So there was this early idea right when the bomb was developed that there was the secret of nuclear fission and fusion, and once that secret was out, oh my goodness, what was going to happen? But then what it actually took to make that information into a working technology required a lot of tacit knowledge that really had to be reinvented in a lot of different places.
This is really fascinating to me. When I was like working for the Navy, I was required, I'm an extrovert, and there's like 5 of us in military technology, right? So like anytime they need somebody that can like make eye contact, I get called. And so I was sent as like the handler on this trip with a bunch of electronic warfare scientists, which is an area of military technology of really high strategic importance to the United States. And it is also an area that you cannot learn in grad school, right? Like you can learn electrical engineering or whatever, and then you have to come to the Navy or the Air Force or whatever, and we will teach you electronic warfare. There's not like a degree in it, right? And so it has a lot of tacit knowledge, and a lot of countries want our electronic warfare. And we don't like that, right? So I take all these guys, me and like 6 guys who can't make eye contact, who are the best electronic warfare people we have, to this foreign country that they do not want to go to, but we've been required to go to because the State Department and the White House decided we were friends again, even though we in the military don't think we're friends. So we'll just call them frenemies. And I will not tell you what country it was. And so we get there, and as we're touring this facility, this laboratory, 2 of the guys that are like the head of this facility pull me over because everybody assumes that I'm intelligence community, right? Which I am not, if only my life were that interesting. And so they pull me aside and they show me like 3 different things that they've been given massive funding to create because they're all on the export control list. And I was like, great. So what the US export control list is for you guys is a shopping list for your government. And they're like, yep, it is basically, if it's on the US export control list and it's critical to something we want, it automatically gets prioritized in what we will fund. And I just had to laugh because I was like, that's brilliant. I mean, respect, right? I mean, it's a bummer. My bosses are going to be super bummed by all this, but they wanted me to go back and tell people, right? I mean, there's a reason they pulled me over there to show me. They were flipping me off, right? I mean, politely, and it was funny, but it was a thing. And it really always stayed with me, where I was like, there's a cost to control. And sometimes it's very direct.
So guys, we want to give you guys a chance to ask questions, and we have a microphone here. So if you have any questions or issues you'd like to raise, or or anything you're wondering about. We'd really love to get reactions to this discussion. I'll say that when I think about secrecy, I don't think it works. And I don't even think of it as necessarily protecting technologies. I see it as imagining it as keeping the country safe, which is what they think. So it's can you keep your nation safe? And you probably can't, but.
My question is about the old versus the new. So you may be aware that there was a balloon over the United States a week or two ago. It wasn't in the news or anything. So
Wasn't made of latex, FYI.
so can you talk about how like we are now seeing old technologies being pitted against newer technologies, and you need an F-22 to shoot down a balloon? And what does that mean for the future? Like whether or not we are going into a new Cold War with China, but we're seeing Cold War-esque situations develop where some small thing is now ruining prospects for détente or just even having meetings.
So it is interesting, right? I think, so the first part of it I'll say is this has always happened, right? In every technological revolution, we've had parallel highways, right, where the old stuff is still being used and the new stuff is coming online. Everybody knows we didn't need an F-22 to shoot down a balloon. We also know that those guys haven't gotten to shoot anything in a while, and there were like 5 guys like, me, man. Like, you never let us shoot stuff down. Let it be me, the South Carolina coast. They're gonna love it. There's gonna be barbecues for us when we get home, right? I mean, it's sort of funny. I'm like 90% sure it was true too. But I do think it's interesting once you go far enough down the path of high tech that again, you circle back, right? Low tech becomes more interesting because what actually came out in a lot of these conversations on the Hill, which I thought was interesting, is we don't track as many slow moving objects. We track fast moving objects because fast moving objects give you less time to decide if it's dangerous or not dangerous, right? And so the irony of it being a slow moving object that becomes the problem is like probably not, well, it probably is lost on an unfortunate number of people, but shouldn't be, right? So now we'll spend $1 billion in the military, like improving radars to track slow moving objects, and that's probably not going to change anything, right? So I do think it's not like it's new. This phenomenon of the old coexisting with the new is something that has always been. But I think what we are going to see play out now is that it's never played out in a forum where everyone knew about it, right? I mean, secrecy is less possible now than ever before. There's like TikTok videos of this balloon being shot down all over the place, right? Everybody has a commentary. Everybody knows exactly what happened. They were videoing like some of the cleanup and the pickup of the technology at sea, right? I mean, we've just never had such public showings of how we coped with the co-occurrence of these two things. So for me, that's actually a more interesting aspect of this, is how do we deal with this when it is embarrassing, it isn't secret, you can't just cordon off every space and tell people to go home that this is a military operation, right? And I think that is a TBD of how the military will respond and react to that, and how Congress will allow them to respond and react to that. And the other thing we've seen is that we've had these unidentified objects going over us all the time, and we just haven't been shooting them down. I also think, and I will be quiet after this, is this narrative of a heating up of the conflict between China and the US serves both countries' militaries quite well, and almost no one else, right? And we're allowing them to create a false choice. And we're all just saying, yeah, this is the choice we have, right? So I think it would be interesting to see more people having a conversation around I don't actually think I have two choices, which is global war between two behemoths where the economy as we know it will disappear overnight, or we just let them have balloons over us. To be fair, we have a lot of balloons over them too, probably. I mean, this is like everybody's got balloons everywhere. This wasn't new. Everybody has a balloon. like Europe has balloons too. People have balloons. Theirs just happened to fall out of the path it was supposed to be on over North Dakota, like super embarrassing for China. But their military is getting a lot out of this as well because they're getting political funding and support as everything heats up. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about the fact that we are all sort of allowing ourselves to be walked down a path. We're not bumbling down it. We are being walked down it.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, those are all spot on comments, and I completely agree. I'm sure there was a room full of guys going, I want to shoot this thing down. I'm reminded of David Edgerton's book, The Shock of the Old. The commentary about this, oh my God, a balloon, this is so, Hindenburg-esque, surely this couldn't still be happening, when in fact, yes, these things are used all the time, and old technologies are incredibly useful, and all of our new technologies, by the way, are built on older technologies. We think that things are created de novo, but they're never created de novo. They're built on the backbones of earlier infrastructures. Cavalry was a huge cavalry and railroads were a huge factor in World War II. I mean, we all focus on the atomic bomb, but all these old-fashioned things were incredibly useful. So, I mean, the reaction to it is itself kind of telling about what the public imaginary of technology and power is, that it has to be the cutting edge AI that's the game changer. I don't think I have anything to add right there. I think Melissa's comments were spot on.
Love the idea, though, of horses and the advent of air forces coexisting. It's amazing.
I'll just mention that one of the first military technologies that was subject to an international ban was hot air balloons, and you were not to be allowed to drop bombs from them. So that was in about 1889, an effort to ban the dropping of bombs from hot air balloons. It's a long history here.
I wanna read that book. Is this why we only do surveillance from hot air balloons? I don't know.
It's banned. You can't drop things from them. So
Fascinating.
yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'd be curious to hear the panel's perspective on the military-industrial complex and how, if at all, that dynamic has been affected by some of the changes you guys have been talking about this evening. Has that military-industrial complex intensified, de-intensified, changed in other ways as a result, say, of the dynamics you were discussing, Melissa, about how a different share of R&D, both internationally and domestically, is taking place by the U.S. government, that it's declined. Is that affecting the military-industrial complex? But just in general, how are you understanding that dynamic?
The reputation of the defense industrial complex has never been worse, right? I think there's a Taylor Swift song in that somewhere, but what's interesting to me is that, in fact, we were just talking earlier about this Economist article that clearly Palantir and Anduril paid a journalist to write about them, right? Which is like an advertisement for Anduril and Palantir, which are some of the most parasitic, aggressive organizations that I've ever seen in Washington, but whatever, it's a personal opinion. But I do think that the pressure of how technology is advancing outside of the government has made a lot of people in Congress and a lot of people in DoD and a lot of people in the surrounding ecosystem deeply frustrated with the defense industrial base because they are created in parallel to the DoD, right? Every rule that the Department of Defense they have. Everything that slows down the military slows them down. They hire people who are retired from the military, right? And they do all of this so that they know really well how to match and understand their customer. But the problem with that is they're very, very slow, and they tend to innovate in very incremental ways. And because often their people can't publish and a lot of stuff is done in secrecy, everybody has to have a clearance, they can't attract a lot of talent. right? And so they have a real struggle with how do they relate. And so what's happening is you see companies like Anduril and Palantir who essentially want to replace the old defense industrial base with a new defense industrial base. But what I would argue that we need is actually we need to spread out the actual power and reach, right? We need to make that defense industrial base much more diffuse. And so we're not actually changing the dynamic very much with these new companies that are coming up. They're just reestablishing a concentrated control in another place, right? So they're just kind of moving the node of control over. They're not, and they're changing the color of it. They're painting it green instead of blue, but it's a very similar dynamic. What you see as a bigger sort of disruptive underlying problem is that what we need is to be able to access technologies from mid-sized companies, from a whole host of companies that are only going to engage with us occasionally. But we literally don't have mechanisms in any part of the federal government that are domestically focused. The entire national security apparatus is about looking outward. It's about foreign affairs. It's about wars on foreign shores. It is not about understand how America functions and works, understand our full sort of slate of capabilities and then capacity for those capabilities, right? Understand our talent, understand our infrastructure. There's literally no one in the federal government whose job it is to really understand the technological base of the United States. States tend to know that about themselves. The federal government does not engage with states because that's boring domestic crap. We don't do that. We play at the big kids table on the international stage. And this is a real problem in a moment where we have much less control over this sort of ecosystem. We are much more dependent on a diffuse ecosystem, but we keep defaulting to the defense industrial base because we know it. Or we'll default to a new industrial base because we know them. And I think this is a dynamic that is under pressure and it's under high criticism. There's a lot of articles being written about how bad this is, but there are very few people who really understand the ecosystem well enough to design de novo new types of relationships with the technological base, because we've only been educated in post-World War II sort of dreams and visions, right? We've only been taught that science started with Vannevar Bush in 1945, and normal is this post-World War II era, even though it's a relatively anomalous moment in our history overall. And so we don't have a lot of people being paid or to think about or educated in a way that allows them or encourages them to think about what would you create if you did away with the defense industrial base tomorrow? If you went back and said, Eisenhower, you're right, this is going to be a bad idea, because he knew this was a bad idea, right? If you went back and said to President Eisenhower, like, this is going to be a really bad idea and this is where we're going to wind up, what would we do instead, right? We don't really have people writing that story, I don't think.
I want to make one, and then I'll turn to you, Rebecca. And I'm not being nostalgic. I'm just going to invoke what was the original concern about the military industrial academic complex. And it was certainly tightly linked to the idea that universities were in some ways, I don't think I'm exaggerating, like sacred spaces for knowledge production, autonomy, independent thinking. They were places outside the domain of destructive politics and certainly engaged with the welfare of mankind. Certainly science and technology always were, they had this underlying value, and the activism on campuses in the United States in the 1960s often centered on the presence on campus of institutions that were deeply funded by defense interests and that were therefore contaminating a kind of a pure space. I don't think that's an issue at all today on the modern campus, and I miss it. So I think we ought to be a little bit concerned about the ways that research across so many different domains, we take it for granted now, but remember, there were protests on the Penn campus around defense funding, research that was carried out here. This was I think there are various plaques on campus showing where protests occurred. It's not that protests are important, it's that the university is important as an institution that represents the highest goals of a society, at least as a college professor. That's my view. Rebecca.
So, yeah, I want to go back to that moment as well. Another one of the major concerns in Eisenhower's speech was about the ascendance of a technocratic elite that would prevent people from making informed decisions in a democracy, such that you just have to trust us. We're the experts. This is the technology we have to develop. And you can't, non-technical people can't possibly understand how important it is or what is inevitably going to be developed, and that undermines the foundations of democracy. I think what we see today, though, is a military civilian industrial complex, right, where there's this assumption that so long as it's profitable, it's good. And that is actually the driving, it's not just about national security, but what is profitable, and if it makes money, then it must be okay. And I think there's a lack of reflection about, because more and more of the technologies that are being driven by the private sector have their primary markets in the private sector rather than in government. And so then the US military or militaries around the world are sort of drawing on what has been produced. Not solely, there isn't a private market for F-35s, obviously, right? Not yet, right? Wait, yeah, that's true. Wait till gun ownership rights go there. But anyway, I think that there's a lack of reflectiveness on that deep interconnection between with dual use technology and the ways in which that's just sort of not questioned, that the technology is going in a particular direction, but is profit enough? What is this really doing in society?
Yeah. Zachary.
Thank you all very much. This has been fascinating. So the question I have builds off of a comment that was just made about the technological base and about these comments that have been made about kind of the persistence of older technologies, and also engages with kind of the focus on the high technology within this. And so the question I have is how we think about the relationship between vulnerability and dependence, especially dependence on complex technological systems, whether or not they are, more high-tech ones of maybe computers and the internet variety, or as we look at recent events, the continued importance of physical infrastructure like railroads, that when they are not maintained, they can cause major disasters in the country. And so I'm curious how that infrastructure plays a role here, the way that becoming dependent on these things and then that dependency kind of becoming banal and in the background creates a threat because we don't see it coming until disaster strikes. And kind of the role also that maybe like things just like banal maintenance play in this. We've mentioned Elon Musk several times here in regards to things like Starlink, but much of the story of Musk right now is also about like Twitter continuing to have problems because they aren't doing basic software maintenance either. So thank you very much.
I love this question. The military is such an interesting microcosm for this question because we love advanced technology, right? Like there's not a piece of technology we don't want. However, they've also started teaching at the Naval Academy now, celestial navigation again. So it went away for a while, and then it became very clear that we would likely, if we were to wind up in a large war, GPS would likely be denied at some point in the conflict. And that's a problem for a lot of things because we were building in a need for GPS. So this goes back to, we accepted a vulnerability because when we built in the use of GPS on basically a civilian network, right? A network that the US military gave to the world as a civilian network, right? I mean, it was generated out of the military, but we built a lot of military, really important military things on GPS. I'm not going to get any more specific than that. I mean, I probably could, but why do that? And so when it became clear that what had been an acceptable vulnerability at the time was now a less acceptable vulnerability because there are alternatives to GPS that other regions like Europe and China and Russia have access to, it's like, well, it's not a mutually assured disruption now. It would be a disruption of us were someone to disrupt GPS, and therefore we need to think about resilience, right? And so one of the very, very funny and easy to talk about ways that manifested is that the Naval Academy actually restarted celestial navigation. The funny thing is too that several guys I know who are retired military, mostly Army, they love maps. The Army, they travel on land, right? They walk places. They really care about reading a map. They're all making their kids learn how to use paper maps. So you got all these 12-year-olds who are just hating their dads, right? Because like they're all having to learn how to like walk around the city with a paper map. So it's funny, but it's this really interesting outgrowth of this particular concern. What I would say is that specifically within the military, we are not necessarily prepared for all of those problems, but we do in fact think about them, right? And so I actually think it's way more interesting in the civilian sector in that it's less predictable what skills people have or don't have across generations. It's like we don't actually know often what the next generation can and can't do. Just like they don't understand what we can and can't do, right? Because they've just grown up with a fundamentally different input. And that also means that for things like influence campaigns, misinformation, disinformation, a lot of this gray warfare that is happening right now across many countries, is that often the folks in charge in these more centralized governments who tend to be older often don't understand how these things are playing out among a younger generation that interacts in this ecosystem in a fundamentally different way. So I think that there's just like more uncertainty into what the actual broad impacts are of some of these technologies, because across generations, they have a different effect on us because we know how to do different things and we don't know how to do different things. Like I'm amazed sometimes at like the calculator thing, right? Because I'm 50. I wasn't allowed to use calculators in school because it's like Chat GPT, right? It's like calculators will make you stupid. They don't, nobody will know math. Our brains will become small, whatever. And I was like, actually, I could have just used a calculator. I mean, I do now, right? But I don't depend on it. And there are a lot of things I don't do on a calculator because it's just faster for me to do by hand. But my niece at 14 can do things on a calculator and do math on a calculator that I can't even access. Like, I'm just like, I don't even know. I've never used a graphing calculator. Like, what the hell is that? Right, and you guys are just like, what do you mean? Like, literally everyone does that when they're 6 years old now, right? So I don't think that it's obvious to us what people know and don't know, and that to me is very interesting.
I'm going to draw on some work of other people who've thought very hard about vulnerability. So Bob Cohen and Joe Nye make a distinction between sensitivity and vulnerability when they're talking about interdependence. And sensitivity is what's the cost when something external happens that you didn't like? All of a sudden you don't have your GPS. What's the cost? Vulnerability is what's the cost after you've adjusted for that loss, right? So if you have multiple options, you are less vulnerable, even though the immediate impact might be significant. So it's more of a strategic understanding of vulnerability. So countries, individuals, organizations that aren't able to adjust, so in the area of climate change, we'd call that adaptation, that aren't able to adapt to this kind of change or to this kind to an attack, to an accidental failure, are much more vulnerable than those that can. But that's distinct from, I'm currently relying on this thing and it might go out. The question is, what are the other options you have available? So I think we just have to sort of keep in mind that broader context when we're thinking about vulnerability. But it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not mine, so I'm credit given.
Thank you. I am an aspiring engineer who wants to work in defense, so I'm kind of coming at this from like a little bit of a different perspective. And I was just wondering, what is your opinion on who should be developing defense technologies? And kind of like we talked a lot about secrecy, I guess like the role that plays into that. So I guess like who should be developing these critical defense technologies that are very important to the military?
So I'll tell you what my first boss told me, first boss in the Navy told me, is that in this new era, when new era to him was like, I don't know, post 1980, I don't know, he started in the 60s, so he'd been around a while. But he was like, we don't make things in defense, we buy things, right? We used to make things in the 70s, we made things, but there are a lot of laws now that say we don't compete with the private sector, so we are mandated to buy things, not make things. So we have one manufacturing facility for bullets still. So we do make our own bullets apparently, somewhere in like Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York or somewhere like that. Jersey maybe, anyway. So I think that one thing to think about is the role of the engineer in the military, which is near and dear to my heart because these are like people I did oversight over and these are my people and I love them. Is to make sure that we understand what we're buying and that we know what the state of the art is and that we are valuing and pressing the state of the art in areas of criticality to defense that others may not value, that maybe shouldn't be done in academic circles or certainly where there is less interest. I think energetic materials is a great example of this, like pretty much it's a very small community of people who make new energetic materials and we need them. But if it weren't for the military, we wouldn't have them, right? And so there are very specific roles for expertise that matter. And it matters that we have people that care about these technologies working, not blowing up and killing people when they are used, that they go where they're supposed to go and they minimize collateral damage. You know, you can say a lot of things about the military, and I understand that not everybody is a supporter, but at the end of the day, we are the worst case scenario people. That is the job we are supposed to play. And at the end of the day, the job of the defense scientist and engineer is to make sure that the politicians and the leadership that decide where we are going to send our military, it is not the military that decides what war we fight, right? It is a political decision where we go. When we send these kids out, and they are younger than some of you, right, to fight wars, it is our job to make sure that what we send them out there with works, that we were not lied to by the people that sold it to us, that it's not going to be like some stupid Google thing where it's like, oh, well, it's just the first beta. If it works 80% of the time, it's fine. If 20% of the people who use it die, like, who cares? Like, that's not how we roll in DoD, right? And it's not how it shouldn't be acceptable. And that we need people inside who care and have a very high standard and a very low tolerance for capitalism getting in the way of the military being able to go out, execute the mission they were given, and to come home alive and in one piece as much as humanly possible. And when they don't, we do our best to patch them back up. And that, to me, is the job of an engineer in the Department of Defense. Yeah, I think that's all I got to say. But you can come talk to me later because I know all of them.
That's great, thank you. I think I would just add, I just want to build on what Melissa's saying here about this tension between, maybe I'll extend and you can tell me if I've got it wrong, but I think there's a tension between what the military needs, which is reliable stuff that's going to work when human beings' lives are on the line, and the motto of Silicon Valley and a lot of tech firms of move fast and break things, right? And a lot of the insecurities and the flaws that we have in technology comes from market incentives to roll things out as quickly as possible so that you capture network externalities, right? So if you can get everybody on your app, then you've captured your market share and then you clean up later. And that is just not the way you can operate, or not the way we want technology firms to be operating with the military, right? Where human lives are on the line. On the other hand, I also think that there's a uniqueness to the military environment in that there's far more uncertainty about what the military is going to face, right? So what is realistic testing? When you're dealing with a customer base of 100 million people, you can roll out your beta versions and figure out pretty quickly what's working and what isn't working with realistic use. You don't have that kind of experience or margin for error with the military, and you're dealing with you're dealing with an intelligent adversary that is trying to make things deliberately unpredictable. So I think the kinds of requirements that you have on technology are very different when you're dealing with military operations than when you're dealing with commercial technology. And that's one of the problems about the marriage between those two fields. So getting to the question of who does it, relying on commercial off-the-shelf technologies, which are developed according to one set of technologies for military operations, which are operating under a different set of constraints, has its problems. Now, it's cheaper, and it may be more capable, maybe. But yeah, there are issues. Do you want to add to that?
Amen to all of that. And I would just say, right, like, again, the role of the internal engineer is often interrogating, what is that delta? Is it cheaper to harden an off-the-shelf technology, or is it more expensive than just creating our own? And sometimes the answer is, it goes both ways, right? And we need smart internal folks who actually understand the difference. I would also just say the tone deafness of Silicon Valley when engaging us is shocking sometimes. We had a large tech company working on a DoD problem, and we were like, you're looking for IEDs, it's a rare event, there's millions of hours of footage, and there's like 10 IEDs or 100. It's a very rare event, it's not good for training data. And he's like, well, we just need more events. And I was like, do you know how many people died in that event? Do you know how many parents had to be called in that event? Like, leave. It's not funny in this building. Where when I worked in the Pentagon in 2009, once a month, wounded warriors who'd just come back with amputations from Afghanistan walked past my door, and we all walked out and we spoke to them, because once a month we had to remember why we were in that building, right? And then I got Google coming in, talking smack to me about, we just need more IED events. Like, there's a cultural mismatch that requires some people in the middle who aren't quite as emotionally involved as me, but also who aren't as tone deaf as Google, right?
And then I'll say that it would be important to think about the many ways that military technologies have developed with limited attention to their long-term consequences, including environmental consequences, including consequences for the experiences of those on the battlefield, for those left behind. And I would say it would be and as you know, engineers are now trained in engineering ethics, but engineering ethics should include, as a matter of training, significant attention to the military-industrial complex, to the production of these technologies. What did those building these technologies not see? What did they not look at? They didn't look at dioxin in Agent Orange, and dioxin is still killing people.
Modern example of this is we improved body armor, and what we got was a great increase in survival in Afghanistan and more 20-year-old quadriplegics than we've ever had.
But they were in,
We
yeah.
only protected the core. And so they would get blown up and lose all their limbs. But
And
survive.
live. Yeah.
And so you do have to really be thoughtful about what you're doing matters.
What's going to happen in the future. All right, we have time for one last question.
Hi. So this question you guys probably cannot answer, but I still want to ask. So as you guys mentioned a lot of time, a Palantir and SpaceX, which they also have commercial use other than military use, like Starlink GPS, and Palantir has their Foundry model. They use it to distribute COVID vaccine. So from investor point of view, do you think the trend will continue, which mean the military technology will attract more and more funds and resource? And is it a good opportunity, like to invest in the future?
I do not give investment advice.
I understand. I understand. It's just like, do you think the trend will continue?
Yeah, I'm a scientist. I've never made money in my life. I'm a government scientist at that. I will say the trend is both positive and slightly frightening. There are a lot of venture capital groups now forming around national security, and there is a new Office of Strategic Capital being stood up at the Pentagon, which I sort of hope will wind up, people will figure out what they're doing is probably illegal like at some point, but whatever. For the time being, it exists, and it's a partnership with venture capitalists, which is tricky. But I think the trend line is definitely towards there's money to be made in defense, and so funding more dual use technology spaces is on the rise. As investment opportunities go, I would say it's pretty high risk though, right? Because if and when something big and difficult happens, the risk tolerance that people who are used to doing business in the commercial space have for really nasty, ugly realities of war is not the same as someone like Lockheed Martin. So, whatever, I don't know.
I think I'm going to leave it at that because I see that we're at time, and I think you concluded that comment very well. Thank you.
I want to congratulate our really wonderful panelists. They're well-informed, thoughtful, and they really gave us a lot of wonderful questions to think about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the good questions.
Okay, good night, guys.